Millions of biological engineers were released into the blistering furnace of the Nevada desert without a single wooden hive or protective net. Why introduce unprotected insects into a landscape that drains the life out of every plant? To the agricultural community, the idea seemed delusional and destined for failure, yet it was the only option left. But these tiny creatures were not ordinary honeybees. They evolved to burrow into alkaline soil and awaken flowers that others avoid. Within only a few weeks, the barren fields began to change in ways no one predicted. But this is just the beginning of the experiment. Before the truckloads arrived, Nevada remained a riddle without an answer. The sun bakes the ground into a hardened crust, creating a surface that tests human patience itself. Ancient lake minerals spread across the soil like a thin, stubborn armor. One can notice how yield slipped away year after year like grains of sand through a hand, signaling that the land was no longer willing to cooperate. Modern solutions collapsed against the region's hostility. It gets more complex further on. One plant species, however, refused to surrender to the harsh conditions. Alfalfa pushes its roots deep into the earth, reaching hidden water veins that other crops cannot access. The muted violet-green stalks stand resilient against the hot winds, waiting for fertilization. If pollinated correctly, the plant produces tiny seeds valuable enough to reshape the economic fate of an entire farm. These seeds help the soil retain moisture, effectively slowing the desert's advance. At first glance, pollination seems simple, but in reality, the alfalfa flower is a mechanical trap. Each blossom conceals a miniature slingshot beneath its petals that snaps open only under specific weight and force. Most bee species cannot tolerate the sudden pop of the mechanism striking them. Honeybees avoid the physical discomfort, while smaller insects lack the muscle strength to trigger the release. One can see fields of purple bloom standing uselessly, like a performance with no audience. Farmers harvested light, half-empty bags of seed, confirming the impasse. By the year 2023, everything reached its breaking point. Production costs rose to unbelievable levels as the soil grew more alkaline. The cruelest irony was that the only bee species capable of the task had nearly vanished from the wild due to chemicals. The solution lay buried in faded research notes, waiting for a redesign. Decades of stagnation had turned Nevada into a fortress, effectively locked from the inside by chemical reliance and persistent human disruption. Why did the key to opening this door remain invisible for so long? Farmers believed they had exhausted every possible technological solution during the long, weary months of the crisis. But without looking down, they missed the answer, lying right beneath their feet in the salty soil. The alkali bee, a solution many had once scoffed at as foolish, waited in the ground. But this is just the beginning. An unexpected discovery emerged from a place no one thought to investigate. Dr. Clara Martinez entered an old university storage room where stacks of research papers sat frozen under layers of gray dust. Time seemed to have erased their value until she turned a specific yellowed page. One can notice how her hand froze upon seeing the vague scribbles dating back to the 1970s. The text referenced a strange bee species that most modern people had never seen or heard of. At first glance, it seems simple to classify it with common pollinators, but in reality, this insect defies standard expectations. It did not make honey, did not build wooden hives, and did not gather into colonies like honeybees. Instead, it lived underground, carving tiny tunnels through the alkaline soil humans considered an enemy of agriculture. It gets more complex further on. Researchers of the past were astonished by a specific mechanical compatibility found in nature. The bee's physical size, its exact weight, and its unique landing behavior matched the alfalfa flower's tiny slingshot mechanism with eerie perfection. No other bee species could trigger this release. However, The notes revealed that the population collapsed rapidly when Nevada began using harsh chemicals in the latter half of the 20th century. Tunnels caved in from soil disturbance, and food sources vanished, taking the bees with them. The process is only gaining momentum. Dr. Clara Martinez sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing the weight of the find. If a bee had evolved to pollinate alfalfa here, the solution had literally been beneath their feet for decades. The only question remained whether it could return. Could a tiny bee, erased from human memory, unlock the door Nevada had pushed against for so long without moving a single inch? When the discovery reached the meeting table, no one dared say it aloud immediately. Yet everyone felt that if alfalfa needed this exact key and humans had destroyed the lock, the path forward was clear. The only way to save the harvest was to reconstruct the conditions lost to time. They needed to recreate the precise environment nature once designed, starting with the soil itself. Tens of thousands of dollars. This is the scale of investment buried beneath the desert surface in the form of an intricate irrigation network. Nevada farmers were forced to execute a maneuver that every agricultural manual considers a blatant contradiction. Instead of fighting to reduce soil salinity for better crops, they began deliberately making the earth saltier to mimic the alkali bee's natural home. Why intentionally turn a corner of a productive farm into a barren, salt-crusted wasteland? It would seem logical to prioritize fertile soil, but without this specific chemical balance, the pollinators will simply refuse to nest. The environment must be reconstructed exactly as it once existed to support the species. One can notice how the soil texture is engineered with laboratory precision. It must be loose enough for the bees to dig intricate tunnels, yet firm enough to prevent these passages from collapsing under the weight of the earth. Moisture levels below the surface are regulated to remain stable without flooding the top layer. But this is just the beginning of the requirements. Salt is spread at an exact concentration that repels parasites but creates ideal conditions for the bees. At first glance, the project looked like an expensive joke to outsiders, but in reality, it was a complex hydrogeological system essential for survival. Experts called it reckless, and local newspapers labeled it the strangest experiment of the year. The preparation required the entire soil structure to be finalized before a single bee could be released. The surface gleams white under the desert sun, resembling a miniature salt flat intentionally placed amidst the green fields. Millions of bees are waiting to be dumped onto this patch, as if they were seeds for the most unpredictable crop ever planted. This artificial habitat serves as an invitation to a species forgotten by time. For those who truly understood alfalfa, the logic was beautiful in its strict necessity. Only one step remained to complete the cycle. The decision to release the swarm could either cause the entire plant to collapse or open a new chapter for Nevada's agriculture. The site stands ready for the decisive moment. Millions of alkali bees traveled inside a convoy of specialized trucks, their engines rumbling heavily as they navigated the dust-choked dirt road toward the experimental plot. The preparation phase had finally concluded, leaving the artificial salt bed gleaming under the fierce Nevada sun like a giant mirror reflecting the technical audacity of the engineers. Far more spectators gathered at the perimeter than anyone anticipated, creating a tense atmosphere around the site. These onlookers arrived not to celebrate, but to witness how this seemingly crazy experiment would inevitably fall apart before their eyes. The trucks slowly ground to a halt, positioning themselves for the critical unloading procedure. Why release the insects directly onto the bare earth without standard protection? To an outside observer, such an action seemed like a death sentence for the confused colony. But the biology of this species required exactly this harsh, salted environment for them to recognize the terrain as their true home. One can notice how the workers began tilting the transport crates, initiating the most controversial moment in the region's agricultural history. Millions of alkali bees poured onto the salted soil as if someone had released a sudden rain of life onto a barren desert. At first glance, this looked like a reckless waste of biological resources, but in reality, it was a calculated gamble on natural instinct. Tiny black specks cascaded to the ground, scattering across the blistering surface without the safety of wooden hives or frames. The scene exploded across social media platforms almost instantly, spreading rapidly throughout the agricultural community. Videos of the release prompted laughter and mockery from viewers, with many feeling secondhand embarrassment for the bees themselves. Experts appeared on television screens, insisting with authority that the insects would not survive more than a few days in such exposed conditions. Newspapers ran dramatic headlines calling the project a definitive step backward for modern farming. But this was only the beginning of the controversy. But amid this storm of public criticism, a small group of specialists stood strangely calm near the perimeter. All the ridicule in the world meant nothing to them until concrete news came from beneath the compacted crust. Because the true answer, whether it be a resounding success or a total collapse, lay hidden deep in the earth where no camera could see. It depended entirely on whether tiny tunnels were already forming in the dark, or if the colony remained stagnant. Nevada had no choice but to wait to see if this bold gamble would become the final punchline or proof that a rejected solution is the strongest one. Zero visible changes appeared on the surface of the salt field during the first days following the release of the insects. Why did the barren soil seem completely lifeless to the observers? To the naked eye, the bold plan looked like a failure. But beneath the compacted crust, the alkali bees were executing a survival program refined over thousands of years. In the slightly humid darkness, they began to dig into the dense substrate. This was not the random, chaotic excavation typical of other ground nesting species, but a calculated engineering operation. Arc-shaped burrows extended downwards, forming near-perfect circular tunnels with almost identical depth and width. From these main arteries, the insects carved out tiny brood chambers one by one. One can notice how they lined the walls with gathered pollen and nutrient-rich secretions to create a sterile environment. Inside these protected vaults, they placed their first eggs, seeds of life completely hidden from any view above ground. But this is just the beginning. Because the location determines survival, the insects chose their spots with extreme precision. It gets more complex further on. Guided by specific soil compaction levels and the scent of dissolved minerals, the bees navigated the dark. They sensed faint moisture rising from the underground irrigation system, pinpointing ideal locations as if reading a geological map unknown to humans. At first glance, the salt crust seemed like a hindrance, but in reality, it acted as a functional shield. It prevented predatory insects from entering while locking in the precise percentage of humidity required for larval development. Each passing day marked the completion of another tunnel and the sealing of a new brood chamber. The return of the species, once thought extinct, was gaining momentum in the middle of the desert. Farmers observed the fields in silence, afraid to admit hope, but sensing the vibrations of activity beneath their feet. Nevada could not yet see the results, but a complex hidden city was growing within the salt-white soil. This infrastructure possessed the potential to alter the agricultural future of the land. The silence underground was preparing to transform into a response that would eventually outweigh all earlier skepticism. Hundreds of meters of purple alfalfa fields began to display the first signs of change, just a few weeks after the subterranean bee city took shape beneath the salt-crusted soil. At first, local farmers noticed only a subtle increase in the number of insects hovering over the crops compared to any previous year. Why did this observation eventually shatter every established assumption regarding pollination dynamics? To the naked eye, It simply looked as if an invisible gate had opened, allowing the insects to pour in. But the answer revealed itself when researchers knelt down to examine the mechanical interaction at the level of individual blossoms. Ordinary pollinators merely visit the flowers, but the alkali bees operate with a different intent. One can notice how each bee lands with a sharp, calculated motion, applying the exact weight and angle required by the plant's biology. At first glance, this interaction seems like a simple landing, but in reality, it triggers the alfalfa's signature pop mechanism with a physical perfection that forced researchers to reevaluate their earlier theoretical models. The flower's keel snaps upward against the insect's chest and abdomen, releasing a burst of fine yellow pollen directly onto the carrier. Unlike honeybees, which often recoil from this impact to avoid the blow, the alkali bees accept the strike without hesitation. But this is just the beginning of the process. They hurl themselves from one flower to another, working without a single pause in their rhythm. It is visible how waves of insects sweep across the purple expanse, moving across the crop lines. Therefore, for the first time in years, the flowers began swelling and transforming into pods promising new seeds. Because the pollination rate of the alkali bees surpassed every species ever utilized, the scientists halted their debates. Their foraging range proved larger than predicted, and their efficiency remained nearly flawless. The farmers realized they were witnessing nature's functional answer to the missing link they had been searching for all along. 3 to 4 times the state's long-term average. These figures define the new reality waiting in the fields. Early summer winds swept across the alfalfa, carrying a thick, sweet scent. Why did an indescribable silence settle over the farm during the decisive seed harvest season? Normally, this period is filled with anxiety about the crop. But that year, the farmers sensed that something unusual was approaching before the work even started. But this is just the beginning. Harvesting machines move steadily along the rows to collect the yield. One can notice the unexpected weight as the first seed bags are lifted by the workers. Whispers immediately spread along the line of mechanical harvesters. The seeds appear more abundant and physically denser than in any previous season. At first glance, the fields look typical, but in reality, the compiled numbers stunned the entire research team. Some areas reached figures that experts had long claimed were impossible for the local climate. Nevada was once a symbol of nature's stubbornness against agriculture, yet this seemingly hopeless place proved that the smallest solutions create the greatest transformations. And this is not the limit. From tiny tunnels beneath the salty soil, the alkali bees rewrote the technical future of the region. Not through miracles, but through biological abilities humans had forgotten, the process succeeded. It is visible how millions of delicate wings achieved what machinery alone could not. Thus, Nevada learned how to bloom again,